The tavern reeked of stale ale and unwashed bodies, but Sir Aldric Blackwood no longer noticed such things. He sat hunched over his wooden cup in the darkest corner of the prancing pony, his once proud shoulders now bent with shame and drink. The other patrons gave him a wide berth, though whether from respect for his tattered knightly garb or disgust at his condition, he could not say. 3 years had passed since the Battle of Ashford Fields. 3 years since his cowardice had cost the lives of 20 good men. The memory burned in his mind like a brand. He had been leading a charge against Saxon raiders when fear seized him like an iron fist. Instead of pressing forward, he had wheeled his destrier around and fled, leaving his men to face the enemy alone. By the time reinforcements arrived, it was too late. Another ale, Sir Knight? The tavern wench spoke the title with barely concealed mockery. Her name was Marta, and she had kind eyes despite her sharp tongue. She was one of the few who still showed him any courtesy, though even that was born more of pity than respect. Aldric nodded without looking up, pushing his empty cup across the scarred wooden table. His hands trembled slightly, whether from the drink or the memories he could not tell. The ale was weak and bitter, but it dulled the constant ache in his chest where his honour used to reside. The tavern door creaked open, letting in a gust of cold autumn air. Aldric glanced up to see a group of younger knights enter, their mail bright and their surcoats unmarked by battle. They spoke in loud voices about tournaments and glory, their eyes bright with the kind of ambition he once possessed. One of them spotted him and whispered to his companions. Soon they were all staring, some with curiosity, others with disdain. "Is that not Sir Aldric Blackwood?" one of them asked, his voice carrying across the common room. "The coward of Ashford Fields?" The words hit Aldric like physical blows. He kept his eyes fixed on his ale, but his jaw clenched involuntarily. The young knight continued his cruel sport. "They say he abandoned his own men to die. 20 souls lost because their leader had no stomach for battle." The knight's companions laughed, the sound harsh in the smoky air. Marta set down Aldric's fresh ale with more force than necessary, sloshing foam over the rim. "Mind your tongues!" she hissed at the young knights. "You know not of what you speak." But the damage was done. The familiar weight of shame pressed down on Aldric's shoulders like a physical burden. He had heard the whispers countless times, had seen the looks of disgust and disappointment. His father's lands had been stripped away, given to a cousin who had never known the sting of battle. His betrothal to Lady Eleanor had been broken, the girl's family unwilling to tie their name to his disgrace. The young knights eventually lost interest and moved to a table near the fire, but their words echoed in Aldric's mind. He raised the cup to his lips with a shaking hand, tasting only bitterness. The ale did little to wash away the flavour of his shame. As the evening wore on, the tavern filled with merchants, craftsmen and labourers seeking warmth and companionship after their day's work. The air grew thick with smoke from the central fire and the smell of roasting meat. Conversations buzzed around him like insects, but Aldric heard none of it. He was lost in his memories, reliving that terrible day when his courage had failed him. A commotion near the door drew his attention. A messenger had entered, his clothes mud-splattered from hard riding. The man looked around the tavern with urgent eyes before approaching the barkeep. Their conversation was hushed but intense, and soon word began to spread through the crowd like wildfire. "Warlord Godwin has returned," someone whispered. "He marches on Westmarch with 500 men." The name struck Aldric like a thunderbolt. Godwin the Black, the Saxon warlord who had led the raid at Ashford Fields. The man who had stood laughing as Aldric's men died. Who had called out taunts about English cowardice as he rode away with his plunder. The man who had stolen not just gold and grain, but Aldric's very soul. Around him, the tavern buzzed with fear and speculation. Godwin was known for his brutality, his skill with the sword, and his hatred of all things Norman. If he was indeed marching on Westmarch, blood would flow like rivers before he was done. Aldric's hand tightened around his cup until his knuckles showed white. For the first time in 3 years, something other than despair flickered in his chest. It was small and fragile, like a candle flame in a storm, but it was there nonetheless. Perhaps it was time to stop running from his past. The messenger finished his business and departed as quickly as he had come, leaving behind a tavern full of frightened faces and worried whispers. But Aldric Blackwood sat in his corner, staring into the dregs of his ale, and for the first time in years, he was not thinking about his shame, he was thinking about redemption. The morning sun filtered through the grimy window of Aldric's rented chamber above the tavern, casting pale light across the sparse furnishings. He had barely slept, his mind churning with thoughts of Godwin the Black and the approaching threat to Westmarch. The ale-induced haze that usually clouded his thoughts had lifted, replaced by a clarity he had not experienced in years. Aldric sat on the edge of his narrow bed, staring at the wooden chest that contained the remnants of his former life. Inside lay his mail hauberk, his sword, and the blue surcoat bearing the black wolf of his family's arms. He had not opened the chest in over a year, unable to bear the sight of what he had once been. With trembling fingers, he lifted the heavy lid. The hinges creaked in protest, as if reluctant to reveal their secrets. The smell of oiled leather and metal greeted him, carrying with it a flood of memories both glorious and terrible. His mail still gleamed despite its disuse, each ring carefully maintained by habit, even in his darkest days. The sword lay wrapped in oiled cloth, its familiar weight both comforting and accusatory. A soft knock at the door interrupted his reverie. "Sir Aldric?" It was Marta's voice, gentle but concerned. "I've brought you something to break your fast." He rose stiffly and opened the door. The tavern wench stood in the narrow hallway, holding a wooden bowl of porridge and a cup of small beer. Her eyes widened when she saw the open chest behind him. "Planning a journey, are you?" she asked, setting the food on his small table. "Perhaps," Aldric replied, his voice rough from disuse. "Tell me, Marta, what do you know of Westmarch?" Her face grew grave. "It's a day's hard ride to the west. Good farming country, but lightly defended. The lord there is Sir Geoffrey Montclair, a decent man, but no warrior. His garrison numbers perhaps 30 men-at-arms. She paused, studying his face. "You're thinking of going there, aren't you?" "To face Godwin," Aldric nodded slowly. "I owe a debt that can only be paid in blood." "You owe nothing to no one," Marta said sharply. "You've punished yourself enough for what happened at Ashford. Going after Godwin will be suicide, and you know it." "Maybe," Aldric admitted, "but I cannot live with this shame any longer. Every morning I wake hoping the pain will be less. But it never is. It grows stronger with each passing day." Marta sat down across from him, her weathered hands clasped tightly together. "I lost my husband at Ashford Fields," she said quietly. "He was one of your men." The words hit Aldric like a physical blow. He had known that some of the local villagers had lost loved ones in the battle, but he had never connected faces to the tragedy. Now, looking at Marta's kind eyes, he saw the depth of his failure reflected back at him. "His name was Thomas," she continued. "A good man, strong and brave. He followed you because he believed in you, as they all did." Her voice remained steady, but tears glistened in her eyes. "When the news came back about what happened, I hated you. I cursed your name and wished you dead." Aldric could barely breathe. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so very sorry." "I know you are," Marta replied. "I've watched you these past years, drowning in guilt and drink. I've seen how it's eaten away at you like a canker. And somewhere along the way, my hatred turned to pity, and my pity to something like understanding." She reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "Thomas would not want you to throw your life away on a fool's errand. He would want you to live, to find some measure of peace." "There can be no peace while Godwin draws breath," Aldric said. "He murdered your husband and 19 other good men. He stole their lives and my honour in one fell swoop. If I do nothing now, if I let him ravage Westmarch as he did Ashford, then their deaths mean nothing." Marta was quiet for a long moment, studying his face. When she spoke again, her voice was soft but firm. "Then don't go as the broken man you've become. If you're truly set on this path, go as the knight you once were." After she left, Aldric sat alone with his breakfast growing cold before him. The porridge was thick and filling, seasoned with herbs from the tavern's small garden. He ate mechanically, his mind focused on the task ahead. He would need supplies, a horse and weapons. More importantly, he would need to remember how to be a knight again. He rose and approached the chest once more. With careful hands, he lifted out the mail hauberk. It was heavier than he remembered, the iron rings cold against his palms. He had worn this same armour at his knighting ceremony 15 years ago, had felt invincible in its protective embrace. Now it felt like a shroud. The sword came next, its blade still sharp, despite years of neglect. He had named it Redeemer in his youth, a presumptuous name for a presumptuous boy. Now the irony was not lost on him. Perhaps the blade would live up to its name at last. though not in the way he had once imagined. As he prepared to don his armour for the first time in 3 years, Aldric caught sight of himself in the polished steel of his sword. The face that looked back was older, lined with care and marked by drink. His once golden hair had grown long and unkempt, his beard thick and unruly. He looked more like a brigand than a knight. But beneath the ravages of time and self-neglect, something else flickered in his eyes. It was faint and fragile, but it was there nonetheless. For the first time since Ashford Fields, Sir Aldric Blackwood had a purpose beyond drowning his sorrows. He had a war to fight. The morning air was crisp as Aldric led his borrowed destrier from the tavern's stable. The horse was a sturdy bay gelding, not the magnificent war horse he had once ridden, but strong enough to carry him and his gear. The stablemaster, an old man named Edmund who had known better days himself, had accepted Aldric's remaining silver without question. "She's got good wind and a steady heart," Edmund said, patting the horse's neck. "Treat her well, and she'll see you through whatever madness you're riding toward." Aldric nodded his thanks and swung up into the saddle. The familiar weight of mail and sword felt strange after so long, but muscle memory began to assert itself. His body remembered what his mind had tried to forget. The road to Westmarch wound through rolling countryside dotted with small farms and patches of woodland. Autumn had painted the leaves in shades of gold and crimson, and the air carried the scent of wood smoke from distant hearths. Under other circumstances, it might have been a pleasant journey. As he rode, Aldric found himself thinking of the men who had died at Ashford Fields. Thomas, Marta's husband, had been a farmer-turned-soldier, more comfortable with a plough than a sword but brave nonetheless. There had been young William, barely 16 and eager to prove himself. Old Marcus, a veteran of a dozen campaigns who should have lived to see his grandchildren grow. Each name was carved into Aldric's memory, like words on a tombstone. The sun climbed higher as the hours passed, and Aldric began to encounter other travellers on the road. Most were fleeing westward, their faces grim with fear. Carts loaded with household goods creaked along the rutted track, driven by families seeking safety in the larger towns. The sight of his armour and sword brought looks of hope from some, disappointment from others who recognised his lone status. Near midday, he came upon a group of refugees gathered around an overturned wagon. The wheel had come loose, spilling grain across the road, while an elderly man argued with 2 younger companions about the best way to repair it. Women and children sat in the shade of nearby trees, their faces weary with travel. Aldric reined in his horse and dismounted. "Do you need assistance?" The elderly man looked up, his eyes widening at the sight of Aldric's knightly garb. "Sir Knight, we would be most grateful for your help. We're trying to reach Bramblewood before dark, but this cursed wheel—" Without a word, Aldric knelt beside the wagon and examined the problem. The iron rim had slipped from its wooden base, a common enough occurrence on poorly maintained roads. Working together with the other men, he managed to reset the wheel and secure it with rope. "Where are you travelling from?" Aldric asked as they loaded the scattered grain back into the wagon. "Millbrook," the old man replied. 3 days passed, Saxon raiders came through our village. They took what they pleased and burned the rest. We heard tell that Godwin the Black leads them, and that he marches on Westmarch itself." A woman holding a young child spoke up, her voice tight with fear. "They say he's gathering more men as he goes. Local bandits and masterless knights join his banner for a share of the plunder." The words confirmed what Aldric already suspected. Godwin was not simply raiding for quick profit, but building an army for something larger. Westmarch was wealthy enough to be worth a sustained siege, and if it fell, nothing would stand between the warlord and the richer towns beyond. "How many men does he have now?" Aldric asked. "Near 700 by some accounts," another refugee answered. "Maybe more. They move like a plague across the land, taking everything and leaving nothing but ash behind. 700 men. The number sent a chill through Aldric's heart. Even if Westmarch's garrison had been reinforced, they would be outnumbered more than 10 to 1. It would be a slaughter, not a battle. After helping the refugees secure their load, Aldric remounted and continued westward. The afternoon brought darker clouds and the threat of rain, matching his increasingly grim mood. Every mile revealed more evidence of Godwin's passage. Burned farmsteads, slaughtered livestock, and abandoned villages that spoke of terror and death. As evening approached, he crested a hill and saw Westmarch spread out in the valley below. The town was larger than he had expected, protected by a stone wall and anchored by a modest castle on a rocky outcrop. Smoke rose from countless chimneys, and he could see people moving about their daily business, apparently unaware of the doom approaching from the east. The sight stirred something in Aldric's chest, a feeling he had not experienced in years. These were innocent people going about their lives, trusting in their lord's protection and the strength of their walls. They had no idea that death rode toward them with 700 swords. He urged his horse down the hillside as the first drops of rain began to fall. The guards at the town gate were nervous but alert, their eyes scanning the eastern horizon as if expecting to see enemy banners at any moment. They recognized his knightly status and allowed him to pass without question, though he caught them exchanging worried glances as he rode by. The streets of Westmarch were bustling with activity, but there was an undercurrent of tension in the air. Merchants hurried about their business with anxious faces, and mothers kept their children close. Word of Godwin's approach had clearly reached the town, even if many chose not to believe it. Aldric made his way through the winding streets toward the castle, his horse's hooves clattering on the cobblestones. The keep was modest but well built, its walls thick and its towers tall enough to command the surrounding countryside. It would withstand a siege for a time, but not against 700 determined warriors. At the castle gates, he was met by a sergeant of the guard, a grizzled man with suspicious eyes. "State your business, Sir Knight." "I am Sir Aldric Blackwood," he replied, the words feeling strange on his tongue after so long. "I seek audience with Lord Geoffrey regarding the threat from the east." The sergeant's eyes widened slightly at the mention of his name, and Aldric wondered what stories had preceded him. But the man merely nodded and gestured for him to follow. "Lord Geoffrey will want to hear what you have to say," the sergeant said as they crossed the courtyard. "We've had precious little news of what's coming our way." As they climbed the steps to the great hall, Aldric steeled himself for what was to come. Soon, he would have to convince a lord he had never met to trust in the word of a disgraced knight. More importantly, he would have to decide whether he was truly ready to face the man who had destroyed his life. The great hall doors loomed before him, heavy oak bound with iron. Beyond them lay his chance at redemption, or his path to an honourable death. The great hall of Westmarch Castle was smaller than those Aldric had known in his youth, but it possessed a warmth that grander keeps often lacked. Tapestries depicting hunting scenes adorned the walls, and a fire crackled cheerfully in the massive hearth. At the high table sat Lord Geoffrey Montclair, a man of middle years with kind eyes and greying hair that spoke of wisdom rather than weakness. Beside him stood his captain of guards, Sir Robert de Clare, a lean man with the weathered face of a career soldier. Several other knights and men-at-arms were gathered around a rough map spread across the table, their expressions grave as they discussed the approaching threat. "My lord," the sergeant announced, "Sir Aldric Blackwood seeks audience regarding the Saxon advance." A hush fell over the assembled men. Aldric felt their eyes upon him, some curious, others openly hostile. His reputation had clearly preceded him, and not in the way he might have hoped. Lord Geoffrey, however, rose from his chair with courtesy and tact. "Sir Aldric," Geoffrey said, his voice carefully neutral, "we have heard tales of your difficulties, but any knight willing to ride to Westmarch's aid in this dark hour is welcome at my table." Aldric stepped forward and offered a bow that was neither too deep nor too shallow. "My lord, I bring news of Godwin the Black's forces. I have seen the devastation he leaves in his wake, and I fear Westmarch faces a siege within days." Sir Robert's jaw tightened. "What intelligence do you bring?" "Our own scouts report conflicting numbers. 700 men, perhaps more," Aldric replied. "I spoke with refugees from Millbrook and other settlements. Godwin has been gathering bandits and mercenaries to his banner, promising them rich plunder from your treasury." The knights exchanged worried glances. Lord Geoffrey gestured toward the map. "Show us what you have learned." Aldric approached the table, studying the rough sketch of the surrounding countryside. His finger traced the likely route of advance. "He will come from the northeast following the river road. It offers the easiest passage for his supply wagons and keeps his flanks protected by the marshland." "Supply wagons?" Sir Robert questioned. "Raiders do not typically burden themselves with siege equipment." "This is no mere raid," Aldric said firmly. "Godwin means to take Westmarch entire, to establish it as a base for further conquest. He has learned the weakness of scattered raids and now seeks to hold territory." Lord Geoffrey leaned back in his chair, his face troubled. "Our garrison numbers 43 men, including knights and men-at-arms. The town militia might add another 60. But they are farmers and craftsmen, not warriors. Against 700, those numbers mean little, Sir Robert added grimly. We could withstand a siege for perhaps a month, but without relief. No relief will come, Aldric interrupted, then caught himself. Forgive me, my lord, but I speak from bitter experience. The neighbouring lords will bar their gates and pray the storm passes them by. We stand alone. An uncomfortable silence settled over the hall. These men had hoped for different news, for some reason to believe their situation was not as desperate as it appeared. Aldric's words had stripped away their last illusions. What do you counsel then, Sir Aldric? Lord Geoffrey asked. Should we abandon Westmarch to its fate? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Every eye in the hall was upon him, waiting to see if the coward of Ashford Fields would counsel flight once more. Aldric felt the weight of their expectation, the crushing burden of his past failures. No, my lord, he said quietly. We make our stand here, Sir Robert scoffed. Brave words from a man who fled at Ashford Fields. What makes you think you will not run again when the battle is joined? The words struck deep, but Aldric had expected them. Perhaps I will, he admitted. Perhaps when I see Godwin's banner approaching, fear will take me as it did before. But I will not counsel others to share my cowardice. His honesty seemed to surprise the assembled men. Lord Geoffrey studied him with new interest. What would you have us do? Our walls are strong but not unbreachable. Our men are brave, but few. Aldric looked again at the map, his mind working through possibilities. We cannot match Godwin's numbers, but we need not fight him on his terms. The approach to Westmarch offers opportunities for a smaller force to strike and withdraw. He pointed to a narrow pass where the road wound between two hills. Here, 20 men could hold against 100 for a time. Force Godwin to deploy his full strength against prepared positions, make him pay for every yard of ground. And when those positions are overrun, Sir Robert asked. We fall back to the next prepared position, Aldric replied. And the next after that. Bleed his army white before he ever reaches your walls. Lord Geoffrey stroked his beard thoughtfully. It would mean abandoning the outer settlements, leaving the farms and villages to Godwin's mercy. They are already lost, Aldric said bluntly. Better to save what can be saved than lose everything in a gesture of defiance. The discussion continued deep into the evening, with maps redrawn and plans debated. Slowly a strategy began to emerge. It was desperate and dangerous, requiring split-second timing and nerves of steel, but it offered hope where none had existed before. As the council broke up, Lord Geoffrey approached Aldric privately. Tell me truthfully, Sir Aldric, why have you come here? What do you hope to gain from this hopeless fight? Aldric met his gaze steadily. I seek nothing but the chance to die with honour, my lord. 3 years ago, I failed 20 good men who trusted me. If I must fail again, let it be in defence of something worthy. Geoffrey nodded slowly. I pray you find what you seek, Sir Aldric, and I pray we all see another sunrise when this is done. Outside, rain drummed against the shuttered windows, and somewhere in the darkness to the east, 700 enemies drew closer with each passing hour. But inside the great hall, plans were being made and courage kindled. Tomorrow would bring the test of whether Sir Aldric Blackwood could reclaim his honour, or if the coward of Ashford Fields would flee once more when battle called. The die was cast, and there could be no turning back. Dawn broke grey and cold over Westmarch, the autumn mist clinging to the valley floor like a shroud. Aldric stood atop the castle's highest tower, watching the eastern horizon where Godwin's army would soon appear. His mail felt heavy on his shoulders, but it was a familiar weight now, no longer the burden it had seemed just days before. Below in the courtyard, Lord Geoffrey's men made their final preparations. Arrows were counted and sharpened, swords honed to razor edges, and prayers whispered to saints who might grant them victory against impossible odds. The plan they had crafted required perfect timing and unwavering courage from every man, qualities that would be tested before the sun reached its zenith. Sir Robert approached, his own armour gleaming in the pale light. The scouts report movement on the river road, he said. Godwin's vanguard should reach the first pass within the hour. Aldric nodded, his gaze fixed on the distant hills. And the men? Frightened but ready, Robert replied honestly. They know the odds, but they also know what will happen to their families if we fail. The two knights stood in comfortable silence, each lost in his own thoughts. Robert had been sceptical of Aldric's plan at first, doubting whether a disgraced knight could be trusted with so many lives. But as they had worked together through the night, refining strategies and positioning troops. A grudging respect had grown between them. "I owe you an apology," Robert said suddenly. "My words last night were harsh and undeserved." "They were deserved," Aldric corrected. "I am what my actions have made me. The question now is whether I can become something more." The sound of a horn echoed across the valley, long and mournful in the morning air. It was the signal they had been waiting for. Godwin the Black had come at last. From his vantage point, Aldric could see the dark mass of the enemy army as it crested the eastern hills. Even at this distance, it was an intimidating sight. Banners fluttered in the breeze, and the morning sun glinted off hundreds of spear points and sword blades. At their head rode a figure in black mail, unmistakably the warlord who had haunted Aldric's nightmares for 3 long years. "God preserve us," Robert breathed. "There are so many of them." Aldric felt the familiar cold grip of fear begin to take hold of his heart, the same terror that had overwhelmed him at Ashford Fields. His hands began to shake, and for a moment he was that broken knight again, turning his horse away from battle while good men died behind him. But then he thought of Marta's husband Thomas, of young William and old Marcus, of all the souls whose deaths weighed upon his conscience. He thought of the people of Westmarch sleeping peacefully below, trusting in their Lord's protection and the strength of brave men to keep them safe. The fear was still there, cold and sharp as winter steel, but it no longer controlled him. He had learned to carry it like a scar, a reminder of past failure that would not be allowed to determine his future. "Signal the first position," Aldric commanded, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his chest. "Let them know the dance begins." The battle unfolded exactly as they had planned, at least initially. Godwin's advance guard struck the first defensive position with confident arrogance, expecting to sweep aside whatever paltry force stood before them. Instead, they found 20 knights and men-at-arms waiting in a carefully prepared killing ground, their arrows and crossbow bolts taking a heavy toll before the position was finally overrun. The pattern repeated at the second defensive line, and then the third. Each time, Godwin's forces paid dearly for ground that was ultimately abandoned, their numbers steadily diminished by the stubborn resistance they encountered. But the cost was not one-sided. With each position lost, Westmarch's small force grew smaller still. By afternoon, the battle had reached the approaches to the town itself. The outer wall had been breached in 2 places, and fighting raged in the streets as townsmen and soldiers fought side by side against the Saxon invaders. The plan was working, but barely. Godwin still commanded perhaps 400 men, while Lord Geoffrey's forces had been reduced to fewer than 30. It was then that Aldric made his choice. Rather than continue the fighting retreat, he called for his horse and rode out to meet Godwin in single combat, as was his right under the old laws. The warlord, confident in his victory, accepted the challenge with cruel laughter. They met in the open ground before Westmarch's gates, 2 knights whose hatred for each other had shaped 3 years of nightmares and regret. Godwin was larger and stronger, his black destrier pawing the ground eagerly as its rider hefted his massive war axe. But Aldric had something the warlord lacked, the desperate need to prove himself worthy of the men who had died believing in him. The combat was fierce and brief. Godwin's first charge nearly ended the fight before it truly began, his axe blade whistling past Aldric's head by mere inches. But the years of guilt and self-loathing had taught Aldric something about endurance, about continuing to fight even when all seemed lost. He weathered Godwin's initial assault and began to press his own attack, Redeemer singing as it cut the air. The warlord's confidence slowly gave way to concern, then to something approaching fear as he realized his opponent would not break as expected. The end came suddenly. Godwin, growing desperate, attempted a mighty overhead blow that would have split Aldric in half if it had connected. But the effort left him overextended, and Aldric's counter-thrust took him through the heart. The great warlord toppled from his saddle, his life's blood seeping into the earth of Westmarch. With their leader dead, Godwin's army lost its cohesion. Some fled immediately, while others fought on with desperate fury. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. The threat to Westmarch had ended with a single sword thrust. As evening fell, Aldric stood once more atop the castle tower, but now he was not alone. The surviving defenders had gathered to celebrate their victory, their voices raised in songs of triumph that echoed across the valley. Lord Geoffrey had offered him lands and title, a chance to rebuild his life from the ashes of his disgrace. But Aldric felt no joy in their celebrations. The weight of his past failures had not been lifted by a single act of courage, nor could the deaths at Ashford Fields ever be undone. What he had found instead was something more precious and more lasting. The knowledge that a man could choose to be more than his worst moment. That redemption was possible for those brave enough to seek it. Marta had been right. Thomas and the others would not have wanted him to die as a broken man seeking meaningless glory. They would have wanted him to live, to find purpose in protecting those who could not protect themselves. As the stars emerged in the darkening sky, Sir Aldric Blackwood began to plan his next journey. There were other villages threatened by other warlords, other battles to be fought by those with the courage to stand against the darkness. He was no longer the drunk knight known as a coward. He was something new, something forged in the crucible of regret and tempered by the fire of redemption. He was a man with honor restored.